Myths outlast the people who created them. They travel from mouth to mouth, from book to book, and with each retelling they become more like undeniable truths, solid, unshakable, obvious. Then a historian comes along, uncovers a weathered manuscript, or finds an artifact in a museum storeroom that doesn't fit any familiar narrative, and the whole house of cards collapses. Here are such stories, compiled for you. 30 chapters, 30 revelations, 30 moments when reality proves far more captivating than legend. If you're ready to uncover the truth about myths that have been believed for centuries, support this series with a like, and share in the comments which revelation shocked you the most. Your feedback will inspire us to delve into new archives. Myth number 1. The horse on the throne, or a joke misunderstood. Picture Rome. Not the Rome from tourist brochures filled with fountains and pizza, but a living, breathing Rome, steeped in political intrigue and fear. Fear of the emperor, of informers, of the very power that could crush a person as easily as stepping on a grape. This is 1st century AD. Rome, and its ruler is a young man named Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, known to history as Caligula. Little Boot, that's what soldiers called the small boy who grew up in his father's military camp, wearing tiny military boots. For centuries, this image has traveled from book to book, from screen to screen, the mad tyrant, so out of touch with reality, so contemptuous of his subjects, that he appointed a horse, his beloved steed named Incitatus, as a member of the Roman Senate. A senator, an honorary citizen, almost a consul. The story has been told with a mix of horror and secret admiration. Here is absolute despotism at its most grotesque, a man blending politics with farce, making high-ranking officials sit alongside a horse in sessions. This tale works remarkably well. It's complete, polished, perfect for illustrating the thesis that absolute power corrupts absolutely. It has entered textbooks, novels, and films. It has become synonymous with political madness. Now, let's open the one primary source from which this story is known. It's Suetonius, a Roman biographer who wrote his Lives of the 12 Caesars about 80 years after Caligula's death. 80 years. That's like a modern author recounting events from the early 20th century, relying solely on rumors passed down through third parties. And what does Suetonius himself write? He uses the phrase, "It is said that he intended to make Incitatus a consul." He did not. He intended according to rumors. The biographer does not assert that it actually happened. Historian Mary Beard, one of the leading experts on ancient Roman history, has spent years analyzing sources about emperors and concluded something that overturns the conventional picture. Caligula seems to have uttered his famous line about Incitatus as a political joke. Cruel, provocative, deliberately offensive, but a joke. German historian Alois Winterling developed this idea in his biography of the emperor and revealed the mechanism behind this provocation. Putting a horse on the same level as the senators means directly confronting them with what you think of their worth, their dignity, their political significance. This is not madness, it's rage expressed through absurdity. Think about it. Caligula grew up in a court where politics was synonymous with survival. His father, Germanicus, died under suspicious circumstances. His brothers and mother were eliminated by the previous emperor, Tiberius. He witnessed how the system worked. He understood the value of every senatorial vote, every bow, every smile in the marble hall. And when this young man, who experienced so much betrayal, claimed that his horse could do a senator's job, perhaps he was telling the truth, or what he believed to be the truth, about his Senate. By the way, the real Incitatus lived quite well. This is well documented in sources. He had a marble stable, an ivory feeding trough, and he wore a purple blanket and a jeweled necklace. He was visited by guests for lavish feasts, perhaps yet another mocking joke from the emperor. But he was never a senator, not once. The myth outlasted the truth for a simple reason. The truth is too thin. It demands too much context, understanding of the first century political game, and knowledge of sources. The story of the horse senator fits into one sentence. And in that sentence lives all we want to think about power, madness, and tyranny. The myth was born from mockery, but perhaps the next one arose from an even more unexpected root, from music that never existed. Myth number 2, the violin over the ashes, or an instrument that never was. Summer of 64. Rome is burning. This is not a metaphor. This is not a rhetorical image. In mid-July, under the night heat, a fire erupted from the shops near the Great Circus, wooden structures soaked in oil, standing closely together, and within hours turned the great city into a roaring sea of flames. Districts burned, temples burned, archives with documents preserving centuries of history burned. People fled, leaving everything behind, trampling each other in narrow streets, screaming in the darkness, filled with the smell of smoke. And here, against this apocalyptic backdrop, history has etched one of its most vivid images. Nero, young, self-absorbed, artistically gifted tyrant, stands atop the palace or on some elevation, takes up a violin, and begins to play. He plays while Rome burns. He plays and, according to some accounts, sings about the fall of Troy. A haunting, yet almost beautiful image. Here is the artist in his madness, a person so detached from reality that they can find aesthetic pleasure in catastrophe. This image entered the language. Playing the violin while Rome burns, a phrase used to describe the criminal indifference of power to the suffering of the people. It's repeated by politicians, journalists, and ordinary people. It lives on. It has just two small problems. Both are fundamental. The first, when a fire broke out in Rome, Nero was in Antium, at his country villa about 55 kilometers from the city. He returned to Rome after learning of the fire, a fact recorded by Tacitus, a historian far more reliable than most sources from that era. Furthermore, Tacitus describes how Nero organized aid for the victims, opened imperial gardens for refugees, and provided grain from stores. This is not the portrait of an indifferent tyrant admiring the flames. The second problem is devastating in its simplicity. The violin did not exist at all as an instrument in the 1st century AD. The violin is an instrument that appeared in northern Italy in the 16th century, about 1,500 years after Nero's death. If he played anything, and this is not confirmed by any reliable sources, it would have been a lyre, a complex string instrument similar to a harp. Nero was indeed passionate about music and singing, which in Rome was considered an undignified pursuit for an emperor, and this seemingly contributed to his bad reputation. But the leap from enjoyed singing to played a non-existent instrument over a fire he wasn't at is immense. Tacitus, cautious and skeptical, wrote that some accused Nero of arson, while others said the fire started accidentally. Nero himself blamed the Christians for the arson, which sparked one of the earliest waves of persecution. Historians still debate the causes of the fire. But there is no place for the fiddler over the ruins in this story, neither factually nor physically. So why has this image persisted? Because it is perfect. It tells us everything we want to think about bad rulers, all in one picture, one gesture. Sometimes a metaphor is more important than a fact. Sometimes it is more dangerous. And behind the next myth lies an artist whose madness turned out to be far more nuanced than commonly believed. Myth number 3, the artist's ear, or what really happened that night in Arles. December 1888, Arles in southern France. A cold, starry night, a night that the artist himself would later capture in colors as thick as the darkness. In a small yellow house on Place Lamartine lived two individuals, a red-haired Dutchman feverishly painting one piece after another, and his guest, the eccentric, self-assured Paul Gauguin, whom he invited and had dreamed about for months, but with whom he now increasingly clashes. What happened that night is known for certain by no one. It is known that a quarrel erupted between them. It is known that Gauguin left the house. It is known that later, in the stillness of the night, Vincent van Gogh took a razor and cut off part of his own ear. It is known that he wrapped the severed piece in cloth and delivered it to a woman named Rachel, a worker at a nearby brothel. It is known that he was found in the morning, bleeding profusely. And here begins the myth. In the public consciousness, this episode has transformed into a story about how an artist, engulfed by madness, cut off his entire ear. The whole ear. Somehow, this whole ear stuck firmly in biographies, in films, in popular retellings. More dramatic, more insane, more convincing. In 2016, researchers made a discovery that clarified the facts. A drawing was found, created by Dr. Felix Ray, the very young physician who assisted Van Gogh in the Arles Hospital that night. In this hand-drawn sketch addressed to American Dr. Irving Stone, Dr. Ray showed anatomically correct what was cut, the lower part of the left earlobe, a small piece, not the whole ear. Where did the whole ear come from? Partly from the artist's self-portraits. Van Gogh painted several self-portraits with a bandaged ear, and they became iconic images. But the artist painted himself while looking into a mirror, which meant the mirror reflection turned the damaged left ear into what appeared to be the right. This gave rise to confusion and speculation that over time filled in the details. There's another layer to this story that's still discussed by art historians today. German researchers Hans Kaufmann and Rita Wildenstein proposed a theory in 2009 that it was Gauguin who cut off the ear, during a quarrel that escalated into a confrontation. This theory is contentious and not accepted by most historians, but it's indicative. Even in this seemingly well-known story, the full picture still eludes us. What stands firm? The artist is a genius, tormented by an illness that at the time could neither be named nor treated. Night. Pain. A small but real piece of flesh wrapped in cloth. And a legend that grew over reality, like ivy over a wall, until the wall itself became unrecognizable. The next myth is also related to the body, but this time to a body encased in steel, which supposedly could not move. Myth number 4. The Iron Man, or the truth about knightly armor. If you've seen even one Hollywood film about the Middle Ages, and you have, you know this scene by heart. A knight in full armor stands before battle. He is dressed by several squires, sweating from the effort. Then he awkwardly climbs onto his horse with the help of a special crane or ladder. Next, he clumsily moves across the battlefield like a tin can being opened by an opponent. If he's knocked off his horse, that's it. He's helpless, lying like an overturned turtle until he's finished off. This is cinema. This is not history. Medieval knightly armor is one of the most outstanding engineering achievements of its time. A Gothic suit of armor from the 15th century weighed on average between 15 and 25 kilograms, approximately the same as a modern infantry soldier's gear. But the fundamental difference lay not in weight, but in distribution. The armor embraced the body over its entire surface, evenly distributing the load across the shoulders, back, hips, and shins. No concentration of weight in one spot. The joint articulations, the elbows, knees, and hips, were designed with such precision that they allowed for almost complete range of motion. Curators from the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York conducted an experiment where volunteers wore authentic 15th century armor from their collection. Participants were able to walk, run, sit, squat, and even imitate combat movements. One of the volunteers jumped onto a horse at full speed, without a crane, without a squire, and without a mounting ladder. Knights indeed trained in armor. Specific exercises for this were documented in medieval fencing manuals that have survived. They jumped over obstacles, climbed ladders and fortress walls, and engaged in foot battles that demanded agility and speed. The notion of a knight as a motionless statue on the battlefield collapses the moment one encounters real historical sources. But where did the myth of the helpless knight originate? In part, it stemmed from the later ceremonial armor of the 16th and 17th centuries, which was indeed extremely heavy and intended for parades rather than battle. Additionally, it arose from the literature of the Romantic era, which created its own image of the Middle Ages, cumbersome, grandiose, and ornate. Part of the myth also comes from simple logic. If it's metal, it must be heavy and uncomfortable. which overlooks the genius of medieval craftsmanship. The armorer who crafted the armor worked with a specific individual, considering their height, weight, and body proportions. Custom-made Gothic armor fit the body like a second skin. It was not a prison of metal, but rather a tool, an extension of the warrior. And the warriors who wore it trained throughout their lives to move in it as naturally as we do in our clothing. The story of the helpless knight is a tale of engineering ignorance by later generations. The next story is about a different kind of ignorance, how society judged a person for something they themselves did not understand. Myth number 5. Typhoid Mary, or the Trial of the Asymptomatic. 1909, New York. In the courtroom sits a middle-aged woman, an Irish cook, a person without wealth, connections, or a famous name. Mary Mallon stares at the judges with an expression that her adversaries describe as stubbornness and her supporters as despair. Surrounding her is a story that has already become a sensation in the newspapers. Typhoid Mary, a living, ticking time bomb, a woman who intentionally infected others with typhoid while continuing to work in the kitchen, fully aware of her danger. This story has made it into textbooks. The name Typhoid Mary has become synonymous with a person who deliberately spreads disease without regard for others. It is still used today, in medical texts, in journalism, and in everyday language. The image is stark and definitive. Here is the villain. Here are the victims. But what really happened in that courtroom? Mary Mallon asserted that she did not believe she was contagious. And it was neither a lie nor hypocrisy. It was her sincere, rational conviction, a belief shared by many educated individuals in 1909, including doctors. The concept of asymptomatic carriers of an infectious disease, that is, the idea that a person can carry and transmit a dangerous pathogen without showing any symptoms of illness themselves, was new, controversial, and far from universally accepted, even within the medical community at the turn of the 20th century. Mary Mallon believed she was healthy. She had never been ill with typhoid, at least not in the sense of illness she understood. How could she be a source of contagion if she wasn't sick? This was not a rhetorical question for her. It was a genuine intellectual dilemma that medicine of that era had yet to fully address. Her first forced confinement on the island, 3 years in isolation, was lifted after she promised never to work as a cook again. But then she returned to that job, under a different name. Here, researchers' sympathies diverge. Some see this as evidence of misunderstanding, while others view it as a sign of a woman's desperation, someone with no other way to earn a living. Ultimately, she was arrested again and confined, this time for life, spending 23 years in isolation. She died in 1938 without ever formally accepting any charges. Historians agree she was treated much more harshly than other known asymptomatic carriers of the time, men, some of whom were linked to far more infections, yet none were imprisoned for life. Typhoid Mary is not a story of a villain. It's a story of a person caught at the intersection of her ignorance, the ignorance of her time, and a social system that conveniently found a scapegoat. The next myth we'll explore is also about a convenient legend, this time, a legend that served the political regime. Myth number 6. Mussolini's trains and how propaganda is born. There are phrases that live separately from their context. At least under him, the trains ran on time is one of them. It captures everything, an acknowledgement of brutality, and at the same time, a justification through efficiency. Some say it bitterly, while others express it with a secret admiration. It's applied to various dictators across different countries and decades, but it originally referred to Benito Mussolini, who established a fascist regime in Italy in the 1920s. The story goes like this. Before Mussolini, Italian railways were chaotic, late, and unreliable. The fascists came to power, and suddenly, the trains began to run like clockwork. They became punctual, clean, and delay-free. This became the main argument of the regime's apologists. Sure, political freedoms were limited, but there was order, there was efficiency, there were the trains. The problem is, the trains had already been running on time before. Most of the modernization of the Italian railways took place between 1900 and 1922. That is, before Mussolini came to power. The nationalization of the railways, the construction of new lines, and improvements in management were all carried out by the previous liberal governments. Mussolini took office in October 1922 and inherited a system that was already functioning. What he inherited along with it was a propaganda apparatus that was skilled at turning others' achievements into its own. Foreign journalists and tourists would visit Italy, travel on the trains, notice their punctuality, and write about it as a regime accomplishment, either unaware or unwilling to know the history of the matter. The fascist press eagerly circulated these articles. The legend grew. Moreover, even during Mussolini's rule, Italian trains were delayed. Not systematically, not catastrophically, but they were late. No regime can eliminate technical failures and weather conditions. The difference was that under Mussolini, it was not customary to report delays in the newspapers. This is a story about how propaganda interacts with reality. It doesn't necessarily lie directly. It simply claims others' merits, suppresses inconvenient facts, and repeats the same message loud and long enough for it to become common knowledge. The next myth arose from a similar process, only instead of trains, it involves knights, and instead of propaganda, it features the romantic fantasies of the 19th century. Myth number 7. The Knight with the Book, or the Educated Warrior of the Middle Ages. When we hear the word knight, a certain image comes to mind. A large man in steel armor, skilled in sword fighting, riding a horse, and perhaps bowing courteously to a lady, but certainly not reading Latin texts by candlelight or studying law. The image of an unlettered warrior possessing strength but lacking education has become so ingrained in our culture that it seems self-evident. The Middle Ages are associated with darkness, and knights are their symbol. However, historical evidence paints a very different picture. The knightly education of the late Middle Ages, particularly from the 12th to the 13th centuries, included not only combat training. An educated knight was considered the ideal of courtly culture. He was expected to compose and perform poetry, understand music, know the basics of theology, and read and write, at least in his native language, and often in Latin as well. Many knights engaged in correspondence, drafted documents, and participated in legal procedures that required literacy. Medieval guides on knightly education, such as the treatise The Book of Chivalry by the Catalan philosopher Ramon Llull, written in the late 13th century, explicitly list not only martial skills, but also wisdom, education, and the ability to judge as virtues of a knight. A knight without education in this value system was as incomplete as a knight without a sword. Of course, literacy levels varied depending on the era, country, and social status. A poor knight from a provincial castle might indeed have been illiterate. However, the claim that knighthood as a class was universally illiterate is exactly that, a romantic stereotype born in the 19th century. The Romantic era, fascinated by the Middle Ages, created its own knights, noble yet wild, brave yet simple. This image worked exceptionally well in literature, but it had little relevance to actual history. The tale of the illiterate knight tells us more about the 19th century than about the 12th. The next myth also arose from a misunderstanding, but a rather stranger one: how contemporaries misinterpreted the business interests of a great inventor. Myth number 8. The Elephant and the Inventor, or a Misunderstood Story. January 4th, 1903. The amusement park on Coney Island, New York. A crowd gathered to witness the execution of an elephant named Topsy, a 50-year-old female elephant that the park's owners condemned to death after she killed 3 people, including a drunken trainer who fed her lit cigarettes. The execution was carried out using electric current. A 30-second film, dark and harrowing, remains from that era. This footage was taken by Thomas Edison's company. And here, the story divides into truth and myth. Myth. Edison orchestrated Topsy's public execution specifically to discredit alternating current, promoted by his rival Nikola Tesla during the so-called War of Currents. He supposedly attended in person, conducting the entire event, making the elephant's death part of his propaganda campaign against alternating current. Reality. By 1903, the War of Currents had long been over, and it concluded with the victory of alternating current. Edison lost that battle back in the 1890s. Topsy's execution occurred 10 years after this conflict ended. Edison was not at Coney Island. His company merely sent a cameraman because documentary filmmaking was part of their business. The park's owners chose alternating current for the execution based on practical considerations, not under Edison's influence. So where did this story come from? It stems from a clear narrative error. Edison did indeed use public animal executions with alternating current during the War of Currents. This is a documented fact. His company filmed Topsy. That is also true. When these two facts combine in the mind of someone unaware of the timeline, a coherent story emerges. False, but coherent. Topsy's death was a tragedy in itself, one that needs no additional dimensions. Her story deserves to be told honestly. And an honest story is one about an animal that spent 50 years in captivity, about the cruelty of the entertainment industry of that time, and about the 30 seconds of footage that became a historical document. Edison has nothing to do with this. The next myth is also about the color black, but it's about something completely different. Myth number 9. Black as a symbol of modesty, or the truth about the Dutch Golden Age. Take a look at the portraits of Dutch merchants from the 17th century, those that hang in the Rijksmuseum or the Mauritshuis. Men in strict black coats with white collars, women in black dresses with pure white lace cuffs, serious faces. No luxury, no extravagance, only austerity, restraint, and Protestant asceticism. This seems logical. The Dutch were Calvinists, who believed in hard work, frugality, and modesty. Naturally, they wore black, out of piety. This explanation seems so natural that no one really questions whether it's true. But in reality, it isn't. Achieving a stable, deep, and uniform black color for fabric dyeing in the 17th century was incredibly difficult and expensive. Natural dyes yielded unreliable black. The fabric would fade, taking on brownish or greenish hues. A durable, rich black required multiple stages of dyeing with costly components: madder, oak galls, iron sulfate. Imported wool and silk fabrics dyed in this black were significantly more expensive than those in simpler colors. In other words, the color black in the clothing of a wealthy Dutchman in the 17th century was primarily a statement of prosperity. It was the most expensive color in their wardrobe, not the cheapest. They wore it to show they could afford it. Lavish embellishments, lace, furs, jewelry, were more visible against the black, further emphasizing this message. Protestant piety certainly played a role in the culture of the Dutch Golden Age, but it expressed itself in different forms, not in clothing color. Wealthy merchants wore black for the same reason modern professionals wear expensive watches. It was a status signal coded in a material object. The next myth also explores how we misinterpret the signals of the past. Myth number 10. A woman by the hearth, or how history rewrote women's labor. There's an image that has permeated the collective imagination so deeply that it is accepted as anthropological truth. Throughout human history, men worked, hunted, fought, traded, built, while women stayed home, focusing on children and domestic chores. This so-called natural order dates back to primitive times and persisted until the feminist movements of the 20th century disrupted it. This image is historically false, almost in every aspect. For most of human history, agriculture was the dominant form of economic activity. In peasant households, which formed the foundation of life for the overwhelming majority of people up until the Industrial Revolution, every family member worked as soon as they were physically able. Women toiled in the fields, sowed seeds, harvested crops, and cared for livestock. In workshops, the wives and daughters of craftsmen were active participants in production. In trade, women kept accounts, managed shops, and engaged in negotiations. Medieval guilds have records of women members, including weavers, brewers, and merchants. In 13th and 14th century London, there were entire professions where women held a majority. Daily labor lasted 12 to 15 hours, and women worked alongside men throughout that time. The image of the woman at the hearth, who does not work but solely manages the household, is a product of the Industrial Revolution and the Victorian ideology of the 19th century, which created the concept of a domestic sphere as a space designated for women. This image then projected back onto all of history, creating the illusion that this has always been the case. But that's not true. The following myth concerns a person whose narrative has also been rewritten by time. Myth number 11. Written in sober truth, or how slander trumps biography. 1849, Baltimore. Edgar Allan Poe dies under mysterious circumstances. He's found on the street in an unconscious state, lives for another 4 days in a hospital without regaining clarity, and passes away without revealing what happened to him. A few days after his death, an obituary appears in the newspapers, signed under the pseudonym Ludwig. Ludwig is Rufus Wilmot Griswold, a literary critic and anthologist who harbored deep personal animosity toward Poe during his lifetime. The obituary began with the words, "Edgar Allan Poe is dead." He was known, but few loved him. It went on to describe Poe as an alcoholic, a drug addict, and an immoral person incapable of true friendship. Griswold thus became his literary executor. In his role as editor of Poe's posthumous collected works, Griswold fabricated letters, edited memoirs, and inserted into biographical texts episodes that never existed. He created the image of Poe that entered the collective consciousness, a dark genius writing in a state of alcoholic and drug-induced delirium, drawing his horror from personal experiences of madness. The reality reconstructed by modern researchers is far more complex. Poe did indeed struggle with alcohol relapses. This is documented. However, these relapses occurred during periods of deep personal crisis and were, according to those who knew him, episodic rather than permanent. He wrote his major works, The Raven, The Murders in the Rue Morgue, The Gold Bug, The Fall of the House of Usher, while sober, with a methodical professionalism that he described in his essays on poetic craftsmanship. Moreover, Poe was one of the first in American literature to theorize about the structure of a work of art. His essay, The Philosophy of Composition, is not the ramblings of a fevered imagination. It is a cold, rational analysis of how a poem is constructed. This is a text about a person with full mastery of their mental faculties. The defamation of Griswold has survived the truth for a century and a half, and it endures precisely because it perfectly matched what the public wanted to see in the author of Dark Tales. The next myth is about another figure whom people love to quote without reading the original work. Myth number 12. Turkey versus Eagle, or A Letter Misunderstood. One of the most enduring American historical anecdotes is that Benjamin Franklin, one of the founding fathers, diplomat, scientist, and inventor, proposed that the national symbol of the United States be not the bald eagle, but the wild turkey. He believed the eagle was of a bad character, while the turkey was brave, honorable, and truly American. This story is often shared with a smile. Look, even the founding fathers sometimes had strange ideas. In reality, Franklin never made such an official proposal. He never insisted on the turkey as a national symbol. He never spoke against the eagle in any official debates or documents. The source of this myth is a single private letter written in January 1784 to his daughter Sarah. In this letter, Franklin ironically points out that the eagle depicted on the seal of the Society of Cincinnati resembles a turkey more than it does an eagle, and he adds that the turkey is, in a sense, a more respectable bird, not a coward, nor a thief who steals food from others. It was merely a playful fatherly jest in a private letter, not a governmental stance. The letter itself was not published during Franklin's lifetime. When it was printed posthumously and the wider public read it, the context of the joke was lost, and the assertion, "Franklin wanted the turkey instead of the eagle," took on a life of its own. This serves as a lesson about how easily statements can be taken out of context, especially when the context is private correspondence and the extracted assertion sounds amusing enough to repeat. The next myth also involves a woman and a man, but their story is much more complex and politically charged than we have been led to believe. Myth number 13. Pocahontas and John Smith, or Hollywood versus history. The forests of Virginia, the year 1607. The young daughter of the Powhatan chief, a teenage girl whose real name was Amonute, though historians more commonly refer to her as Matoka, throws herself between the executioner's axe and the head of the condemned English captain. The captain is saved. A truce is established between two cultures. A bond of love forms between two people. This is how the story appears in the version many of us know. A version solidified by Hollywood, living in collective memory as a touching tale of overcoming prejudice and the power of human connection. However, this story has several significant problems. First, at the time the events are described, Pocahontas was approximately 10 to 12 years old, while John Smith was 27. There could be no romantic element in this story from the outset, and there is none in any serious historical source. Second story. The tale of the rescue comes from Smith's memoirs, written 17 years after the events. In his earlier notes, created shortly after the incidents, Smith makes no mention of any rescue. This episode only appears in his later recollections, when Pocahontas had already passed away and could neither confirm nor deny the account. Third story. Historians studying the Powhatan culture have suggested that, if the rescue ritual did indeed occur, it might have been part of a traditional initiation ceremony into the tribe, rather than an impulsive act of self-sacrifice by a girl for a foreigner. Smith may have simply misinterpreted what he saw, or correctly interpreted it but used it differently in his narrative. The true story of Pocahontas is far more tragic and significantly more interesting than the Hollywood version. She was kidnapped by English colonists, forced to adopt Christianity, married planter John Rolfe, brought to England as a living exhibit of the civilized savage, and died there at around the age of 21 without ever returning home. This is a tale of colonialism, of identity theft, of a person turned into a symbol. It's a much more important story than a romantic fairy tale. And now, let's explore the next myth about an item that also existed quite differently than commonly believed. Myth number 14. The chastity belt, or a non-existent invention. Among all the medieval images that have permeated popular culture, this one is perhaps the most cinematic. A stern knight, setting off on a crusade, places a metal belt with a lock on his wife, stashes the key in his pocket, and departs to fight for years in the Holy Land, completely at ease regarding marital fidelity. This imagery appears in comedies, dramas, and historical novels. It seems so organic to the era, a rough, brutal time where men were owners and women were property. The problem is, historians cannot find a single credible piece of evidence that chastity belts were actually used in the medieval period. The only known illustration resembling a chastity belt from that era comes from a drawing in the treatise Belli Fortis by German engineer Conrad Kaiser, dated around 1405. However, researchers studying this drawing in the context of the entire treatise tend to view it as a humorous illustration rather than a depiction of a real device. Physical examples of chastity belts, found in museum collections across Europe, including those in Vienna and Paris, which were displayed as medieval artifacts in the 19th and 20th centuries, invariably turn out to be 19th century creations upon detailed examination. Medical and metallurgical analyses of these items show that the metal, construction, and surface processing correspond to the technologies of that period. It seems they were made as antique fakes for collectors with an interest in the dark exoticism of the Dark Ages. The concept of the chastity belt, according to historians, first appeared in Western European literature around the 16th to 17th centuries, not as a factual practice, but as a satirical image. Over time, this satire was taken at face value, and the fact began to live its own life. The next myth also revolves around how a literary metaphor became a historical fact, but this time on a larger scale. We are talking about an entire civilization. Myth number 15. Salt on the ruins, or a metaphor, become history. 146 years before our era. Carthage, a great Phoenician city, a rival to Rome for 100 years and 3 bloody wars, is burning. This is a historical fact. The Roman army, commanded by Publius Scipio Aemilianus, destroyed the city after a 3-year siege. The destruction was methodical, brutal, and complete. This is also a fact, documented in ancient sources. Part of the population was killed, the rest sold into slavery. Then one final touch was added to this story. The victors supposedly sowed the soil with salt so that nothing would ever grow in Carthage again, a symbol of total annihilation, salt as a curse for all time. This image is almost perfect. It's conclusive, ritualistic, carrying the weight of ancient cruelty. It has become a metaphor. To sow salt on the ruins means to utterly destroy a defeated enemy. It's used in political texts, literature, and historical analogies. There's just one problem. None of the ancient sources, neither Polybius, nor Livy, nor Appian, nor Strabo, mentions any salt. Not at all. Not a word. The accounts describe burning, destruction of walls, loss of life, and enslavement, but no salt. Historian Benham Steele conducted a detailed investigation into this matter and found that the story of salt emerged in American historiography in the 19th century. The first known reference to it in modern texts dates back to 1863. Apparently, American historians borrowed the image from biblical tales of land curses, or simply invented it as a fitting metaphor to conclude the story, and then this image gained the status of fact through repetition. This is a special kind of historical falsification, not intentional deception, but the effect of the telephone game across generations of scholars. Someone wrote metaphorically, the next reader took it literally, the one after that quoted it as fact, and so on. The next myth demonstrates a similar mechanism, but this time the protagonist is much more elegant. Myth number 16. A cape over a puddle, or a story invented by a biographer. Elizabeth I, dressed in a splendid gown and surrounded by courtiers, stands before a puddle on London's cobblestone street. The young, gallant Walter Raleigh, a poet, sailor, and adventurer, steps forward with a theatrical gesture, removes his cloak from his shoulders, and lays it down before the Queen's feet so she won't wet her shoes. The Queen smiles with satisfaction. The courtiers whisper in admiration. Raleigh wins the favor of the Queen. This story is so often cited as an illustration of the Elizabethan era, courtly manners, and clever wit that it almost feels like a given. It has become a symbol of gallantry. The source is unique. It comes from the biographical essay by Thomas Fuller, The History of the Worthies of England, written around 1662. Raleigh died in 1618. There is at least a gap of 44 years between the event and its description, and likely much more, if we assume the events refer to Raleigh's early career at court, in other words, to the 1580s. There's an 80-year difference between the event and its account. Thomas Fuller was known for his storytelling talent. His writings were appreciated for their liveliness and engagement, qualities that, in biographical writing, are sometimes achieved at the expense of accuracy. There are no contemporary sources to confirm the cloak story. No diaries from courtiers, no letters, no official documents. This does not prove that the story didn't happen. It proves that we have no grounds to claim it did happen. This distinction is crucial, yet it's often overlooked when a good story is in demand. The next myth concerns the scale of destruction, which we also tend to measure incorrectly. Myth number 17. The Bloodiest War, or the Shadows of Mongol Conquest. World War I, 1914 to 1918. The mud of the trenches, gas attacks, days-long artillery bombardments, millions dead on both sides of the front. It is often referred to as one of the most devastating catastrophes in human history, the First Industrial War, the first war in which the technology of killing scaled to previously unimaginable levels. Textbooks often describe it as the deadliest war until World War II, as if humanity had not experienced conflicts of this magnitude before the 20th century. This is a misconception. Not regarding the scale of the casualties of World War I, they are monstrous and indisputable. The misconception lies in the belief that history prior to this time did not know comparable levels of destruction. Look back to the 13th century, to the conquests of Genghis Khan and his successors. The Mongol campaigns swept through Asia and parts of Europe from about 1205 to 1350. They obliterated advanced civilizations in Central Asia, such as the Khwarezmian Empire, of which little remains. They destroyed Baghdad, the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, one of the largest cities in the world, a center of science and culture, in 1258. Estimates vary, but between 100 to 800,000 people were killed in Baghdad. This single event dealt a blow from which the Arab world took centuries to recover. Demographic historians studying this period estimate the total number of deaths during the Mongol conquests to be between 40 to 60 million people. Against the backdrop of a global population estimated to be between 300 and 400 million, this signifies the death of 10 to 15% of humanity. In terms of today's population, that would translate to over 1 billion victims. The First World War claimed around 17 million lives, a staggering figure. However, in relative terms, considering the world's population, the Mongol conquests were incomparably more destructive. They remain in the shadows partly because their victims lacked the opportunity to document their history. Their written traditions were wiped out along with their libraries. The next myth involves another shadow that is often overlooked. Myth number 18, Slavery and the North, or a history that's painful to remember. Slavery in the United States is viewed as a Southern phenomenon. This is the familiar narrative: cotton plantations, grand columned mansions, the Confederacy. In contrast, the North represents industry, freedom, and the fight against slavery. It's no wonder the Civil War divided the country along these lines: the South as the territory of slavery, the North as the territory of freedom. This narrative is convenient. It creates a clear moral divide, allowing residents of northern states to identify themselves with the side of good in this historical drama. However, it is misleading. Slavery existed in all 13 British colonies by the end of the 17th century. New York, the largest city in the northern colonies, had the second largest percentage of enslaved population in North America by the 18th century. Slavery was not officially abolished in New York until 1827, more than 50 years after the Declaration of Independence. Some estimates suggest that enslaved labor was used to construct and maintain much of the city itself, but the issue goes beyond the legal status of slavery in the North. The northern industrial economy was deeply intertwined with the system of slavery through cotton. New England textile mills processed cotton grown by enslaved hands on southern plantations. Financial houses in New York funded plantation agriculture. Insurance companies in New England insured enslaved individuals as property. When historians claim that slavery was Southern, they are describing the geography of plantations, not the geography of the system itself. The system was national. Acknowledging this is uncomfortable because it dismantles the tidy narrative framework. Yet history is rarely convenient. The next myth involves a movement that is also often described in overly simplified categories. Myth number 19, 60s feminism, or the invisible women of the movement. If you ask most people about the feminist movement of the 60s and 70s in the United States, they will likely conjure the image of a white, middle-class, college-educated woman, perhaps a graduate of a prestigious university, tired of the homemaker role. This stereotype has disproportionately occupied the space of historical memory, pushing aside those who largely laid the groundwork for the movement. Feminist historians working with archives from labor unions and civil rights organizations of that era reveal that the revival of feminism in the early 1960s was largely a working-class movement. Women working in factories and service jobs, Black, white, and Latina, faced specific economic demands: equal pay for equal work, protection against sexual harassment in the workplace, and paid maternity leave. Organizations like the Commission on the Status of Women, established by John Kennedy in 1961, included union activists and working-class women among their key participants long before women's liberation became a mainstream topic in middle-class magazines. Historical memory often archives movements through their most media-friendly representatives. In the 1960s, media showed significantly more interest in educated white women than in union activists from factories. As a result, some voices remained in the archives while others entered textbooks. This isn't the first time history has favored a convenient narrative. The next myth is one of the most politically significant in this collection. Myth number 20. States' rights, or what the Confederates wrote themselves. The American Civil War from 1861 to 1865 was one of the bloodiest conflicts in American history. Around 650,000 casualties. Some estimates suggest even more. And one of the most enduring myths in American historical memory is that the Confederacy fought not for slavery, but for the principle of states' rights, the right of regional governments to determine their own policies without federal interference. This narrative gained popularity after the war and is known as the Lost Cause. According to this view, the Confederacy was a noble cause, defeated by a numerically superior opponent, and the reasons for the war were much more complex than just the preservation of slavery. There are primary documents written by the Confederacy's own leaders when they had no reason to conceal their intentions. Declarations of secession, official documents passed by the Confederate States in 1860 and 1861, clearly and unambiguously state the reasons for secession. Texas's declaration names slavery as the cornerstone institution and explicitly discusses racial superiority. Mississippi's declaration opens with the words, "Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery." Georgia's declaration is almost entirely dedicated to protecting slavery from federal restrictions. Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy, famously declared in his cornerstone speech in 1861 that slavery is the cornerstone of the Confederacy. These are not historians' interpretations. They are the words of the Confederacy's leaders, recorded in official documents. Narrative about the rights of states was developed after a defeat, partly as a psychological mechanism, partly as a political strategy. The following myth is about a man whose real achievements also became tangled in a web of simplifications. Myth number 21, Franklin and the Kite, or Who Discovered Electricity? A storm. 1752. Benjamin Franklin stands in a field, holding a kite on a stormy night, launching a string with a key into the turbulent sky and waiting. Lightning strikes the kite. The key sparks. Electricity travels down the wet string into the scientist's hands, and, without suffering serious harm, he triumphantly announces that electricity has been discovered. This image is one of the most famous in the history of science. It graces textbooks, is recreated in cartoons, and is used as a symbol of scientific boldness and curiosity. However, there are several fundamental inaccuracies in this narrative. First, Franklin did not discover electricity. Electrical phenomena were known and studied long before him. Experiments with electrostatics were conducted by European scientists for several decades. What Franklin proved was the electrical nature of lightning. The fact that lightning is an electric discharge rather than, say, the anger of gods or a supernatural occurrence. This is an important scientific discovery, but fundamentally different from the discovery of electricity. Second, and far more serious, historians of science doubt that the famous kite experiment was conducted exactly as described in popular versions. If lightning had indeed struck the kite, meaning if the full force of the lightning had traveled down the string, Franklin would have been killed on the spot. Electricians who perished while attempting to replicate this experiment confirmed this without a doubt. What transpired during Franklin's experiment remains a subject of scientific debate. It's possible he observed static induction from the storm clouds rather than a direct lightning strike. Franklin himself described the experiment in a letter, but he never provided detailed accounts of how exactly everything unfolded. The mystery remains. What is not in doubt is his significant contribution to the science of electricity and the invention of the lightning rod. The next myth is about another word, the meaning of which we have also inherited with distortions. Myth number 22, Vandals in Rome, or How the Word Came to Be. 1952, Paris. A student writes on the wall of a building. A passerby is outraged. Vandalism! And this word seems so organic, so ancient, so connected to its origins that no one questions, when did it actually appear? The word vandalism has existed for only about 250 years. It was not coined by a historian describing the destruction of Rome by the Germanic tribe of Vandals in 455. It was invented by French clergyman Henri Grégoire in 1794 to to describe the destruction wrought by revolutionary crowds upon churches, palaces, and works of art during the French Revolution. When it comes to the Vandals and their behavior in Rome, the story is much more complicated than the pejorative term suggests. The Vandals did indeed enter Rome in 455 and looted the city for 2 weeks. This is a historical fact. However, several modern sources note that the Vandal army acted relatively disciplined for a military force of that era, which typically raided cities. They systematically carried off valuables, gold, silver, works of art, and people as hostages, but they did not set buildings ablaze en masse or engage in indiscriminate slaughter of the civilian population. A contemporary author, Prosper of Aquitaine, remarked that the Vandal king Genseric forbade killing and arson. Comparing this with other sackings of Rome, like in 410 when the Visigoths under Alaric took the city, reveals an unexpected result. The Vandals' behavior was, in some respects, less destructive. Gregory used the term Vandals as a label for political opponents, and the label stuck. The next myth also relates to a perception that has persisted despite historical evidence. Myth number 23. Alfred and the Cakes, or How Popular Heroes Are Born. The 9th century, West Saxony. The great English king Alfred is hiding in the marshy lowlands, fleeing from Danish Viking invaders who have defeated his army. He seeks refuge in the hut of a poor peasant woman who, unaware of her guest's identity, asks him to watch over the cakes baking by the fire. Deep in strategic thoughts about saving his kingdom, Alfred forgets the cakes. They burn. The woman scolds him, not knowing who she is reprimanding. This story is one of the most well-known tales of monarchs in English tradition. It speaks of a great man capable of being both noble and humble, of the king's unity with the common people, and of human frailty even among the strong. The problem lies in the timeline. This story first appears in written sources around 1000. Alfred died in 899. There is over a century between the king's death and the first mention of the story about the cakes. Historian Charles Plummer, one of the leading researchers on Alfred's biography, described the story as completely incompatible with the true history of his reign, not because Alfred couldn't have taken refuge with peasants, but because the narrative obviously serves a specific ideological purpose, to create the image of a people's king, close to the common folk. Alfred was indeed an extraordinary ruler. This is recorded in sources from his time. He reformed the legal system, supported education, created a navy to defend against Danish raids, and preserved the independence of Wessex. His real achievements are significant, yet the popular memory of these real accomplishments was insufficient. So, a story about cakes was needed. The next myth is also about a name that says something entirely different from what we think. Myth number 24. Nazis and Socialism, or the word in the name. The National Socialist German Workers' Party. The name itself seems to speak for itself. Here are the socialists. A workers' party. Socialist. Right in the name. Therefore, Nazism is a form of socialism, and the Nazis belong to the left side of the political spectrum. This argument is repeated in certain political discussions with remarkable regularity. History tells a fundamentally different story. Adolf Hitler hated socialism. Not rhetorically, not for show. He despised it as a political system and ideology, and this hatred was inseparable from his anti-Semitism. In his mind, Jewish Bolshevism and Marxist socialism were synonymous with a conspiracy against the German nation. His Mein Kampf, a political testament written long before he came to power, dedicates a significant number of pages to the struggle against Marxism. When the Nazis came to power in January 1933, one of the first groups to end up in concentration camps were socialists and communists, the real left-wing politicians, union leaders, members of the Social Democratic Party of Germany. This happened literally in the first weeks after the Nazis took power. The name of the party with socialism in it was a propaganda decision from the 1920s, when the party sought to attract the working-class vote by competing with real left-wing parties. This was marketing, not a political program. The real economic policy of Nazi Germany was aimed at cooperating with big business and destroying independent unions, which is in direct opposition to a socialist agenda. Reading the political content from the name of the party is much like trying to determine the ingredients of a dish just from the name of the restaurant. And the next myth is about a place, which we also see as completely different from how it actually was. Myth number 25. Marble and bronze, or the Colosseum we don't know. When we think of the Colosseum, we envision picturesque ruins, of imposing yellowish travertine arches, of an open ring of walls through which the sky is visible. This is one of the most recognizable forms in world architecture, and it exists in our imagination as the authentic image of Rome. But this is the Colosseum dismantled for building materials, damaged by earthquakes and thousands of years of neglect. This is not the Colosseum that the people of Rome saw in the 1st or 2nd century AD. The Colosseum, inaugurated in 80 AD under Emperor Titus, was clad on the outside with smooth, gleaming white marble, reflecting the Mediterranean sun. Inside, it was adorned with marble and bronze statues, niches featuring figures of gods and heroes, colorful marble floors. Decorative metal elements, bronze shields, and ornamental crests complemented the facade. Next to the Colosseum stood a colossal statue, a 30-meter bronze figure of Nero, later transformed into the image of the sun god Helios, which, according to one version, gave the amphitheater its nickname, Colosseum, from the word colossal. This statue disappeared in the Middle Ages. Its bronze was melted down. The marble facade began to be dismantled during medieval times. The building materials were too valuable to leave lying in a massive, inactive amphitheater. Palaces, churches, and homes in Rome were built using stone taken from the Colosseum and other ancient monuments. What we now refer to as ruins is the result of not only time, but also the intentional use of the building as a stone quarry over the centuries. What we see is a skeleton. And the next myth concerns words that supposedly existed where they never actually were. Myth number 26. Dragons dwell here, or the migration of cartographical legend. Dragons dwell here, hic sunt dracones. This phrase is widely believed to have been inscribed by medieval and Renaissance cartographers in parts of the map where the known world ended and the unknown began. White spots of unexplored territory, the edges of the earth, terra incognita, along with a warning inscription cautioning travelers that beyond lay nothing but danger and unknown beasts. This image has become a metaphor, a cultural cliché, a title for books, films, and video games. It perfectly describes the psychology of exploration, the boundary between the known and the unknown, the daring spirit of those who dared to cross it. The only problem is that this inscription appears on exactly 2 maps in all of medieval and Renaissance cartography. Just 2. The first is the Hunt Lennox globe, made around 1500 AD and currently housed in the New York Public Library. The second is the so-called ostrich egg globe, dated from the same period, discovered a few years ago and apparently a copy of the first. In both cases, the inscription is located in a specific area, off the coast of Southeast Asia. It does not indicate unknown territories in general. It is presumably a reference to sea monsters described by travelers who ventured through those waters. There was no tradition of writing "dragons dwell here" in unexplored parts of maps. Medievalists who studied medieval cartography unanimously agree on this. Unexplored territories were usually left blank, or filled with other images, people with peculiar appearances, exotic animals, sea creatures, but not the standard dragon inscription. The origin of the myth lies in a blend of several sources and the appeal of the image. And the next myth is about a man who may have never existed. Myth number 27. William Tell, or the hero without a biography. Mountainous Switzerland, the end of the 13th century. The Austrian governor Gessler placed his hat on a pole and ordered all passers-by to bow to it. The freedom-loving mountaineer William Tell refused. As punishment, and as a test, Gessler ordered Tell to shoot an arrow at an apple placed on his own son's head. Tell shot. The apple was struck. A boy survived. This story has become a symbol of Swiss national identity, a freedom-loving people standing up for their independence against foreign oppression. Wilhelm Tell emerged as a national hero, immortalized in Schiller's play, Rossini's opera, and numerous monuments and folk festivals. Yet, the historical existence of Tell is not supported by any documents from the time of the events described. Swiss historians, who have delved into this topic for centuries, have determined the following. The first written mentions of Wilhelm Tell appear in documents from around the 1470s, almost 200 years after the supposed events. This is a significant gap for a historical legend. In no administrative document or chronicle from that time related to the cantons of Uri, Schwyz, and Unterwalden is Tell's name mentioned. But even more remarkable is another discovery. The tale of the skilled archer forced to shoot an apple from his son's head exists in several Scandinavian sources, including Saxo Grammaticus's Gesta Danorum, written around 1202, which tells a similar story about an archer named Toki. This predates the supposed life events of Tell by at least 2 centuries. The question of whether Tell was a real person, a legendary character, or an adapted Scandinavian motif continues to engage historians today. His non-existence does not diminish the importance of Switzerland's history of struggle for independence. This history is real, but Tell is a symbol in it, not a person with a biography. The next myth is also about a symbol, just from a different culture and era. Myth number 28, Ankh and Egyptomania, or how fashion for antiquity is born. Ankh, a cross with a loop instead of the upper bar, one of the most recognizable symbols in global culture, and perhaps one of the most widely reproduced. It appears on jewelry, tattoos, album covers, and decorative items. It's worn as a sign of connection to the, quote, ancient wisdom of Egypt, as a symbol of life and eternity, and as an aesthetic element that appeals to the mysterious. Indeed, the Ankh represented, quote, life in the Egyptian tradition. This is true. It appears in thousands of images connected to gods, royal power, the afterlife, and life force. It is one of the central symbols of the Egyptian religious system. But there's an important question. What do modern people wearing the Ankh associate with the original symbol? Contemporary Egyptomania, the fascination with Egyptian aesthetics and symbols, has a very specific historical origin. The Napoleonic campaigns in Egypt from 1798 to 1801. The French army arrived in Egypt with scientists and artists who documented what they observed. Upon returning to France, these materials were published in the monumental Description of Egypt, sparking a wave of European fascination with Egyptian aesthetics in architecture, decorative arts, and fashion. The second wave of interest was sparked by the discovery of King Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922. This was a European concept, a vision of Egypt filtered through a European perception, aestheticized and detached from its religious and cultural context. The Ankh, which made its way into modern jewelry through this filter, carries not an Egyptian tradition, but a European imagination of that tradition. These are not the same. And the next myth is about an event that wasn't as random as it might seem. Myth number 29, the café principle, or the mechanics of historical coincidence. June 28, 1914, Sarajevo. The morning of this day could have been just another ordinary day in history. It could have been. A group of young nationalists lined the route of Archduke Franz Ferdinand's motorcade. One of them, Gavrilo Princip, throws a bomb. The bomb bounces off the car and explodes under the next vehicle, injuring several people. The motorcade rushes towards the town hall. The assassination attempt fails. Gavrilo Princip, standing further along the route, realizes the moment has been missed. The motorcade is passed. He steps aside to a nearby cafe or shop. And then a so-called coincidence changed the course of the 20th century. The motorcade turned back. After the official reception, the Archduke wanted to visit the wounded in the hospital, taking a revised route. The driver of the lead car received no information about this change and turned the wrong way. He stopped, right there, right where Princip was standing. This episode is often described as one of the greatest coincidences in history. A terrorist accidentally encountered his target at a cafe, coincidentally stopping for a snack after a failed assassination attempt. Historians studying that day through primary sources clarify the scenario. Yes, the route was changed. Yes, the meeting happened by chance in the sense that Princip didn't know beforehand that the motorcade would pass here. However, Princip didn't just stop for a snack and leave the area. He remained in the zone where the Archduke was expected to pass, deliberately awaiting an opportunity. He didn't retreat after Chebrinovich's failure. He waited. This is not a coincidence. It is a blend of intention, anticipation, and circumstance, a cocktail that often lies behind events later described as fateful coincidences. History is not defined by chance, but chance is present, especially on days when the destinies of nations are decided. And the final myth of this collection is about a man whose fate is similarly depicted through an image that strays far from reality. Myth number 30, the death of Genghis Khan, or a commander who was never seen falling. He created the largest land empire in human history. His armies marched from the Pacific Ocean to the Caspian Sea, from the Mongolian steppes to the gates of Central Europe. His name became synonymous with military power, the brutality of a conqueror, and, at the same time, absolute greatness of strategic talent. Genghis Khan. His death in popular culture is a fitting finale. A great commander, fallen in battle, ends his life much as he lived. A warrior dies with his weapon in hand, fallen on the battlefield or not, but certainly in the heart of the action. This is how we envision the end of such individuals: life and death as a unified heroic narrative. The reality depicted by historical sources, scarce, contradictory, yet fundamentally converging, paints a completely different picture. Genghis Khan died in 1227 during the siege of the Xisha state, located in what is now northwestern China. Not a single reliable source describes his death in battle. The official Mongolian historical narrative speaks of illness, variously interpreted as complications from a fall off his horse or a severe infection acquired during military campaigns. The Secret History of the Mongols, the closest account to the events, recounts his illness and death in the camp. Persian and Chinese sources offer versions that differ in details but agree on one point: he did not die in combat. One later version, lacking reliable sources, describes his death from an arrow wound. Another, even more exotic, claims he died due to a captive. Both fall into the category of stories told about people of great stature. A death must be dramatic, dignified, and narratively compelling. The reality, a sickness in a military camp, at an old age for that time and lifestyle, fails to meet this expectation. We find ourselves returning to the same point. History favors images over individuals. The image of a great warrior dying in battle overshadows the truth of an elderly man succumbing to illness in a tent. This does not mean that Genghis Khan is any less great or significant as a historical figure. It means that greatness does not require a beautiful death, and that the stories we tell about great people often reflect more about us than about them. 30 stories. 30 revelations. And in each of them, not just a correction to textbooks, but something deeper. A lesson on how myths are born, why they endure, and what they reveal about those who believe in them. Myths exist not because people are foolish. Myths endure because they are beautiful, because they provide explanations, because they tell a story, complete, clean, with a moral. Reality is rarely so neat. In reality, Caligula mocks the Senate, and that joke is lost through the ages, becoming a tale of madness. In reality, Nero is 50 kilometers away from the fire, and his name still burns along with the city. In reality, Van Gogh merely cuts a small piece of his earlobe, yet this morphs into a story about an entire ear. In reality, Pocahontas was a teenage girl, not a romantic heroine. Truth requires effort. It demands sources, context, and a willingness to part with a beautiful image. It requires acknowledging that the past is more complicated than we would like it to be. But that is precisely why it is more valuable than any myth. Because it is real. Because behind every debunked myth, there are real people, with their genuine fears, true motivations, and real lives that are far more complex and human than any legend suggests. The archive is open. Come back again.